You are not on the guest list, sir. The security guard stepped in front of Ethan Carter before he could reach the conference room doors. Several people nearby glanced at the grease-stained maintenance uniform, the worn work boots, and the faded pickup truck visible through the building's glass entrance. Nobody noticed the quiet disappointment that crossed Ethan's face. Nobody asked why he was there. They simply assumed he did not belong. Ethan nodded politely, thanked the guard, and stepped aside. A moment later, a younger man in an expensive suit walked past him carrying the folder Ethan had spent 3 nights preparing. The man accepted congratulations for a proposal he barely understood. Ethan said nothing. Sometimes dignity looked a lot like silence. 20 minutes later, Ethan was back at work replacing ceiling fixtures in the same corporate headquarters. The building belonged to Whitmore Holdings, one of the largest companies in the state. As a maintenance worker, he spent most days fixing problems people never noticed. As a single father, he spent most nights making sure his 16-year-old son Luke never felt the weight of the sacrifices happening behind the scenes. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while employees hurried toward meetings. Ethan climbed down a ladder, checked his work twice, and quietly helped an elderly receptionist carry several heavy supply boxes across the hallway before returning to his task. Nobody applauded. Nobody even looked up. Across town, Luke was finishing classes in a crowded school hallway. He checked his phone and found a message from his father reminding him not to forget his engineering scholarship application deadline. Simple words. No lecture. No pressure. Just steady support. After work, Ethan stopped by the grocery store, carefully comparing prices before placing items into a cart. He calculated totals in his head before reaching the register. Responsibility had taught him to stretch every dollar. Later that evening, he sat at the kitchen table beneath a dim light. A utility bill rested beside Luke's scholarship paperwork. Ethan paid the electric bill first. Then he reviewed Luke's application. Essay line by line. He noticed a technical error in one section and corrected it with the precision of someone far more educated than his current job suggested. Luke frowned. How did you know that? Ethan smiled faintly. I have seen a few things. The answer revealed nothing and somehow raised more questions. The next morning began before sunrise. Ethan drove his aging pickup truck past a roadside diner where regular customers were already filling booths with coffee mugs and conversation. At Whitmore Holdings headquarters, unusual tension hung in the air. Rumors spread through the building about the company's CEO, Claire Whitmore. Employees whispered about canceled meetings, sudden schedule changes, and a major deal that appeared to be collapsing. Nobody knew the full story. By late afternoon, Ethan was replacing a damaged access panel near an executive floor when he heard voices inside a nearby conference room. One voice belonged to Claire. The strain in it was impossible to miss. Then came a sentence so quiet, he almost thought he imagined it. Please do not hurt me. I am already broken. Silence followed. Ethan froze for only a second before continuing his work. He never looked through the glass. Never listened further. Whatever battle the CEO was facing belonged to her. Yet something about those words lingered long after the hallway fell quiet. Later, as Ethan checked his mailbox outside his small home, he discovered a notice that threatened Luke's scholarship eligibility due to missing documentation. It was a mistake, but a serious one. Ethan stared at the letter beneath the glow of the porch light. Inside the corporate tower, a powerful seal seemed to be falling apart. Outside his own front door, the future he had worked so hard to protect suddenly felt uncertain. And neither of them yet realized their lives were about to collide in a way that would change everything. The scholarship notice remained on the kitchen table long after midnight. Ethan read every line 3 times before finally setting it beside the utility bill he had paid the night before. Someone at the Scholarship Foundation believed Luke's application lacked required documentation. Without correction, months of effort could disappear. Ethan rubbed his eyes, folded the letter neatly, and began gathering records instead of complaining about the mistake. Responsibility had taught him that panic rarely solved anything. Action usually did. Before sunrise, he was already in his pickup truck heading toward a 24-hour copy center. The streets were nearly empty except for delivery vans and a few early commuters stopping at a roadside diner. Ethan organized transcripts, recommendation letters, and financial records with remarkable precision. The employee helping him noticed how quickly he found every document. You should have been an attorney, she joked. Ethan smiled politely, but said nothing. Some truths remained tucked away behind years of sacrifice. After dropping Luke at school, Ethan returned to Whitmore Holdings. The building buzzed with nervous energy. Employees whispered in break rooms and hallways. Rumors about the CEO's troubles had only intensified. While replacing lighting components near the executive floor, Ethan noticed a young intern struggling to carry several boxes filled with archived files. Without hesitation, he climbed down from his ladder and helped her move them to storage. The intern thanked him repeatedly. Ethan simply nodded and returned to work. Later that morning, a facilities manager became frustrated when a climate control system unexpectedly malfunctioned. Several contractors studied the problem and argued over possible causes. Ethan quietly listened while organizing tools nearby. When they stepped away for lunch, he examined the system for less than 10 minutes. By the time the contractors returned, the problem had been isolated and temporarily stabilized. The manager stared at the equipment. "Who fixed this?" Nobody answered. Ethan was already replacing ceiling panels down the corridor. The manager glanced toward him but dismissed the thought. Maintenance workers were not supposed to solve problems like that. Around noon, Ethan sat alone on a bench outside the building and ate a simple sandwich from home. Nearby, executives entered black SUVs while assistants hurried between meetings. Through the glass facade, he noticed Claire Whitmore crossing the lobby. She moved with the confidence expected of a CEO, but something about her posture seemed different now. The memory of her quiet words lingered in his mind. "I am already broken." For a brief moment, she looked less like a powerful executive and more like someone carrying a burden nobody else could see. That evening, Ethan checked the mailbox again. No response from the scholarship office. Another obstacle. Another delay. Inside the house, Luke tried to stay optimistic, but Ethan could see the disappointment behind his son's smile. Rather than offer empty promises, he spent the evening helping Luke prepare backup plans. Community college options. Additional scholarship opportunities. Alternative pathways into engineering. Quiet preparation instead of wishful thinking. As the night deepened, Ethan opened an old storage box searching for one missing document that might solve the scholarship problem. Beneath family photographs and faded paperwork rested something unexpected, an identification badge from a chapter of his life Luke had never fully known. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before carefully setting it aside. The next morning, a message arrived from Whitmore Holdings requesting maintenance support on the executive floor. It seemed routine, yet before the day was over, Ethan would find himself standing only a few feet away from Claire Whitmore for the very first time. The request from the executive floor arrived shortly after 8 in the morning. A conference room had lost power during preparations for an important meeting. Ethan loaded his tool cart, checked the work order, and rode the service elevator upward. He expected another routine repair. Instead, the moment he stepped into the hallway, he found himself closer to Claire Whitmore than ever before. Several executives stood outside the room arguing about schedules and delays. Claire listened quietly, her expression controlled but exhausted. The confidence she showed the company still existed, but now Ethan could see the strain beneath it. He recognized the look. It was the face of someone carrying more than anyone realized. While technicians searched for the source of the outage, Ethan examined the electrical panel. Within minutes, he noticed a sequence error others had overlooked. He restored power so quickly that one executive blinked in surprise. "How did you find that?" the man asked. Ethan simply shrugged and returned to organizing his tools. Claire watched the exchange from across the room. It was a small moment, but something about it stayed with her. People with genuine competence rarely felt the need to announce it. Later that afternoon, Ethan left work early to visit the scholarship office across town. The building sat near a church parking lot where volunteers were preparing for a community food drive. After reviewing Luke's file, an administrator explained that additional documentation might still save the application. It was not a guarantee, but it was hope. Ethan thanked her sincerely and spent the next hour gathering information rather than dwelling on frustration. On the drive home, he stopped at a grocery store to pick up a few essentials. Near the entrance, an elderly customer struggled with a damaged shopping cart. Ethan quietly fixed a loose wheel using a simple tool from his pocket before continuing inside. The woman never learned his name. She only smiled and wished him a good evening. Small acts rarely changed headlines. They changed people. The next morning brought another unexpected encounter. Ethan arrived at Whitmore Holdings before sunrise and found Claire standing alone in the lobby, staring through the glass entrance toward the empty parking lot. For a moment, neither spoke. Then a receptionist accidentally dropped a stack of folders across the floor. Ethan immediately stepped forward to help gather them. Claire did the same. Kneeling among scattered papers, they reached for the same folder. "Thank you," Claire said softly. Ethan nodded. "Everyone has enough problems already." The words were simple, but something in his tone made her pause. Most people around her wanted something. A promotion, approval, access. This man seemed interested only in helping. As Ethan stood, one document slipped from the folder stack. His eyes landed briefly on a page filled with financial projections and operational risk assessments. He glanced once and immediately identified a calculation error. He hesitated, then quietly pointed it out to the receptionist before walking away. Claire looked at the page herself. He was correct. The mistake could have caused significant problems later. For the first time, curiosity replaced assumption. A maintenance worker should not have spotted that error at a glance. As Ethan disappeared down the hallway with his tool cart, Claire found herself watching him longer than expected. Meanwhile, Ethan's phone vibrated with a new message from the scholarship office. Additional information had surfaced about Luke's application. It could solve everything, or create an entirely new problem. The message from the scholarship office arrived just after dawn. Ethan read it while sitting in his pickup truck outside a roadside diner. For one brief moment, relief washed over him. The missing documentation had been found, but the relief disappeared almost immediately. A new review process had been triggered because of inconsistencies in older financial records connected to Luke's application. The scholarship was still alive, but now it faced another delay. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the stack of paperwork he carried everywhere. One problem had been solved. Another had quietly taken its place. At Whitmore Holdings, the pressure inside the building continued to grow. Rumors surrounding Claire's struggling merger negotiations had become impossible to ignore. Employees whispered near elevators and coffee stations. Investors were asking questions. Board members were demanding answers. Claire maintained her composure, but the exhaustion behind her eyes grew harder to hide. Late that morning, an unexpected problem disrupted a major executive presentation. A secure video conference system failed minutes before an important meeting. Senior technology consultants rushed into the room and began offering conflicting explanations. Ethan happened to be nearby replacing damaged fixtures in the hallway. As he passed the conference room, he glanced at the system screen for only a few seconds. The error looked familiar. One consultant confidently blamed a network failure. Another insisted it was hardware. Ethan quietly hesitated before speaking. "The authentication sequence is looping." The room fell silent for a second. Several people stared at him. One consultant laughed softly. "Thank you, maintenance." The dismissal was immediate. Ethan nodded and continued walking. 15 minutes later, the consultants discovered he had been exactly right. Nobody apologized. Nobody acknowledged it. Yet when Claire learned what had happened, something shifted inside her. It was not enough to explain who Ethan really was, but it was enough to deepen the mystery. During lunch, Claire found herself watching from her office window as Ethan sat alone outside near the employee parking area. He was helping a nervous young intern review a resume before an upcoming interview. He listened carefully, offered practical advice, and never once mentioned himself. When the conversation ended, the intern walked away smiling with renewed confidence. Claire noticed something unusual. Ethan seemed to improve people's lives without expecting credit. That afternoon brought a different kind of misunderstanding. An executive discovered confidential documents had been accidentally left in a common workspace. Ethan happened to be the last person seen nearby. Suspicion spread quickly. Nobody openly accused him, but the implication hung in the air. Ethan calmly explained that he had moved the documents away from a leaking ceiling panel to prevent damage. Security footage later confirmed his account. The matter ended almost as quickly as it began. Yet the incident revealed something uncomfortable. Many people still assumed the worst about him before considering the facts. After work, Ethan stopped by the school hallway where Luke was attending a scholarship information session. Several parents discussed college costs, financial aid, and uncertain futures. Ethan listened quietly while reviewing paperwork. One counselor noticed his detailed notes and asked if he worked in education. Ethan smiled faintly. No, just trying to help my son. Again, the answer felt incomplete. That evening, Claire sat alone in her office long after most employees had gone home. On her desk rested a report connected to the conference room failure. Ethan's explanation had been technically precise. Far too precise. Curious, she requested access to older personnel records connected to contractors and facilities staff. She expected to find nothing unusual. Instead, one incomplete entry appeared in a decades-old database archive. Most of the file had been removed, but one line remained visible. Claire stared at it for several seconds. Then she leaned forward. For the first time, she realized Ethan Carter might not be who anyone believed he was, and the missing pieces of his story were suddenly becoming impossible to ignore. Claire stared at the incomplete personnel record long after the office had emptied. Most of the file had been archived years earlier, but one surviving line remained visible. Ethan Carter, former systems analyst and infrastructure specialist. Advanced certification level. The date attached to the record was nearly 20 years old. Claire read it twice, then a third time. Nothing about the quiet maintenance worker she had been observing matched the image she had built in her mind. Yet suddenly many small moments began connecting. The conference room system failure, the financial projection error, the climate control diagnosis. None of them had been accidents. The next morning, Ethan followed his normal routine. He stopped at the diner before work, reviewed Luke's scholarship paperwork over coffee, and answered a message from the scholarship office requesting yet another supporting document. The process felt endless, but he refused to let frustration reach his son. By the time he climbed into his pickup truck, he had already created a plan to solve the latest problem. At Whitmore Holdings, Claire found herself watching Ethan differently. Not with suspicion, with curiosity. Around midday, a serious operational problem emerged inside one of the company's regional facilities. A software-driven logistics system malfunctioned, disrupting deliveries and threatening an important client relationship. Executives gathered in a conference room, exchanging theories and assigning blame. Claire attended remotely, while Ethan happened to be replacing access panels nearby. Through the partially open doorway, he heard enough to recognize the issue. He kept working. It was not his place to interrupt. But when one manager stepped outside looking overwhelmed, Ethan quietly asked a single question. The manager answered. Ethan asked two more. Then he suggested a sequence of checks. Less than an hour later, the problem was isolated and corrected. The solution worked exactly as he predicted. The manager returned to Claire's office, visibly stunned. How did a maintenance worker know that? He asked. Claire did not have an answer. Not yet. That afternoon brought a deeper discovery. While gathering archived records, Claire located a second file connected to Ethan's past. Unlike the first, this one contained context. Years earlier, Ethan had held a respected technical position with substantial career growth ahead of him. Performance evaluations described exceptional analytical ability, leadership potential, and uncommon integrity. Then the record stopped abruptly. No scandal, no failure, no termination, simply a resignation. Claire sat back in her chair. Why would someone walk away from a future like that? The answer arrived unexpectedly a few hours later. Ethan received a call from Luke's school and immediately left work. Claire happened to see him exiting the building. Concern overcame curiosity. She followed at a distance. The destination was not another job interview or hidden business venture. It was a hospital waiting room. Through the glass entrance, Claire watched Ethan sit beside an elderly woman who appeared frightened and alone. He spoke gently, helped her complete paperwork, and stayed until family members arrived. Only afterward did he leave. The receptionist later explained that Ethan volunteered there several times each month because years ago strangers had helped his late wife during her illness. Claire stood silently for several seconds. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. His choices had never been about ambition. They had been about responsibility, about people, about keeping promises. That evening, Ethan returned home and found a new letter waiting in the mailbox. His expression changed the moment he read it. Across town, Claire sat alone in her office, staring at the growing collection of facts surrounding a man she barely understood. Neither of them knew it yet, but the letter in Ethan's hand and the truth Claire had uncovered were about to collide in a way neither could avoid. The letter waiting in Ethan's mailbox carried both hope and pressure. The scholarship committee had agreed to continue reviewing Luke's application, but they now required a formal financial verification hearing. Missing the appointment would almost certainly end Luke's chances. Ethan folded the letter carefully and placed it beside the growing stack of documents on the kitchen table. Across from him, Luke tried to stay optimistic. Ethan smiled and discussed next steps with quiet confidence. But once his son went upstairs, he sat alone staring at the utility bill, scholarship paperwork, and a calendar that suddenly seemed far too full. Responsibility had a way of arriving all at once. The next morning began before sunrise at the diner near the highway. Ethan reviewed financial records while drinking coffee and organizing folders. By 7 o'clock, he was already at Whitmore Holdings. The company faced a new crisis. A major client had reported severe operational inconsistencies across multiple facilities. Consultants were being hired. Emergency meetings filled conference rooms. Anxiety spread through the building. Ethan spent the morning repairing access systems on the executive floor while listening to fragments of worried conversations. Shortly before lunch, one of the facility managers approached him unexpectedly. "I heard about what happened with the logistics problem," the manager said. "Would you mind taking a quick look at something?" Ethan hesitated. Helping was easy. Becoming visible was harder. Still, he followed. Within 20 minutes, Ethan identified a pattern connecting several seemingly unrelated system failures. The explanation was logical and precise. The manager stared at him. "How did you see that?" Ethan simply pointed to the data and returned to work. By late afternoon, multiple departments confirmed that his observations were correct. Word spread quietly through the building. People still saw a maintenance worker. Yet more and more employees found themselves asking the same question. What exactly had Ethan done before this job? Meanwhile, Claire continued uncovering pieces of his story. Every discovery challenged her assumptions. Every observation revealed the same pattern. Competence without arrogance. Knowledge without self-promotion. Strength without cruelty. That evening, she noticed Ethan leaving the building carrying a box of donated supplies. Curious, she followed from a distance once again. His pickup truck eventually pulled into a church parking lot where volunteers were preparing food packages for struggling families. Ethan spent 2 hours unloading supplies, repairing a broken storage shelf, and helping organize deliveries. Nobody treated him like a hero. He did not act like one. He simply worked until the task was finished. Claire remained in her car, watching through the windshield. The more she learned about him, the conference room felt smaller than usual as Ethan stepped inside. Several executives sat around the table. Some looked curious. Others looked annoyed. A few seemed openly suspicious. Claire sat near the far end of the room, watching quietly. The meeting began with questions about the operational problems Ethan had helped solve. At first, the tone remained professional. Then one executive leaned forward and asked the question everyone had been thinking. How does a maintenance worker know more about these systems than our consultants? The room grew still. Ethan did not become defensive. He simply answered what was necessary. Years ago, before life changed direction, he had worked in infrastructure analysis and systems optimization. He left when his wife became ill and his son needed him. No dramatic speech. No attempt to impress anyone. Just the truth. The explanation surprised some people. Others remained unconvinced. One executive muttered that experience from 20 years ago should not matter now. Ethan nodded politely and accepted the criticism without argument. After the meeting, Claire walked beside him, toward the elevator. For several seconds, neither spoke. Finally, she asked the question that had been building for weeks. "Do you ever regret leaving?" Ethan looked toward the lobby windows where morning sunlight reflected across the parking lot. "Sometimes I miss the work," he admitted. "I never regret choosing my family." The answer stayed with Claire long after he walked away. Later that afternoon, Ethan stopped at Luke's school to deliver additional scholarship documents. The school hallway buzzed with students discussing graduation plans and college acceptance letters. Luke met him near the counselor's office. He tried to appear calm, but Ethan could see the uncertainty behind his eyes. The financial review hearing was only days away. Their future remained unresolved. Ethan handed over the paperwork and quietly encouraged him to focus on finishing the semester strong. As they left the building together, Luke asked a question he had never asked before. "Mom would have wanted me to keep going, right?" Ethan's expression softened. More than anyone. The conversation was brief, but it carried years of grief and hope beneath the surface. That evening, another unexpected development shook Whitmore Holdings. A major investor questioned decisions connected to Claire's troubled merger negotiations. Internal reports began circulating. Pressure increased from every direction. While reviewing one of the reports, Claire noticed something startling. The same analytical patterns she had seen in Ethan's suggestions appeared in an older strategic assessment attached to company archives. The document had helped save Whitmore Holdings from a costly mistake years earlier. The author field was incomplete, but a reference number matched one connected to Ethan's old records. For the first time, Claire realized his hidden competence might have influenced the company long before either of them officially met. Yet uncertainty remained. Why had someone with that level of insight remained invisible for so long? The next morning, Ethan stopped by the diner before work and found a certified letter waiting in his mailbox when he returned home that evening. The scholarship hearing date had been moved forward unexpectedly. The new schedule directly conflicted with a critical day at Whitmore Holdings. For the first time, Ethan faced a choice he could not easily solve. One path protected his son's future. The other might determine whether Claire's company survived the crisis closing in around it. And very soon, he would be forced to choose. The conflict arrived faster than Ethan expected. The scholarship hearing and Whitmore Holdings emergency board review were scheduled for the same morning, only 30 minutes apart and across opposite sides of the city. There was no practical way to attend both. For the first time in years, Ethan found himself facing two responsibilities he could not carry simultaneously. One involved a company fighting for survival. The other involved his son. The choice should have been simple. Yet life rarely respected simple answers. Before sunrise, Ethan sat alone in a diner booth with coffee growing cold beside him. Luke's scholarship documents rested on one side of the table. Notes connected to the company's operational crisis sat on the other. Through the window, his aging pickup truck waited beneath gray morning skies. He stared at both stacks for a long time. Then he quietly moved the company papers aside. Family came first. It always had. At Whitmore Holdings, the atmosphere was tense. Investors were demanding explanations. Board members questioned Claire's leadership. Several executives had become increasingly dependent on Ethan's insights, even if they were reluctant to admit it publicly. When word spread that he would not attend the review meeting, frustration quickly followed. One executive openly accused him of abandoning the company at a critical moment. Another suggested his recent involvement had been exaggerated from the beginning. The same people who had doubted him months earlier found it easy to doubt him again. Claire defended him as much as she could, but pressure surrounded her from every direction. Meanwhile, Ethan sat beside Luke inside a crowded administrative building. The hearing room resembled a hospital waiting room more than a place where dreams were decided. Students and parents filled plastic chairs while nervous conversations drifted through the air. Ethan remained calm for Luke's sake, but the delay had created new complications. Several financial documents had been flagged for additional review. The hearing was postponed yet again. This time, nobody could guarantee the scholarship would survive. Luke tried to hide his disappointment. He failed. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder and reminded him that one decision would never define his future. Yet the words felt heavier than usual. Outside the building, rain had begun to fall. Back at Whitmore Holdings, the board review deteriorated quickly. Important questions remained unanswered. Operational inconsistencies continued generating concern. Investors pushed harder. Claire fought to hold the room together, but without key supporting evidence, her position weakened. During a break, one board member questioned whether she had placed too much trust in a maintenance worker whose background remained unclear. The comment struck harder than Claire expected. For the first time, she realized how much Ethan's quiet presence had come to matter. That evening, Ethan returned home exhausted. A new utility bill sat on the kitchen counter, another reminder that responsibilities never paused. Later, he checked the mailbox hoping for good news from the scholarship committee. There was nothing. No update. No decision. Only silence. Then his phone rang. The call came from Claire. Her voice sounded different than before. Tired. Fragile. Honest. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she quietly admitted that the company was on the verge of collapse and that she no longer knew who to trust. Ethan listened without interruption. Finally, she whispered something that brought him back to the hallway months earlier. I do not think I can survive another failure. Ethan closed his eyes. Pieces of the puzzle suddenly aligned. He understood something now that nobody else had seen. The truth behind Claire's fear, the truth behind the company's crisis, and the truth hidden within his own past. But revealing it would force him to expose parts of himself he had spent years keeping buried. As rain tapped against the windows, Ethan stared at an old file resting inside a storage box. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether the truth was finally worth the cost. The old file remained on Ethan's kitchen table long after midnight. Inside were records he had not opened in years. Strategic assessments, infrastructure models, crisis management reports, documents connected to a life he had quietly left behind when his wife became ill. Outside, rain tapped against the windows. Upstairs, Luke slept. Ethan looked toward the hallway and made his decision. The next morning, before sunrise, he stopped at the diner one final time. The waitress refilled his coffee and wished him luck without knowing why. Ethan smiled gratefully, folded the file into his worn messenger bag, and headed toward Whitmore Holdings. Some battles were worth stepping back into. Not for pride, not for recognition, for people. When Ethan arrived, the atmosphere inside the company felt heavier than ever. Executives moved through hallways with worried expressions. Investors had scheduled another emergency review. Claire stood near a conference room window staring at the city skyline. She looked exhausted. For the first time since they met, Ethan saw fear she could no longer hide. He quietly handed her the old file. At first, she frowned in confusion. Then she began turning pages. Her expression changed with every document. The reports contained detailed analyses of operational weaknesses, risk forecasts, and strategic recommendations written nearly 2 decades earlier. More importantly, they accurately predicted several structural problems now threatening the company. Claire looked up slowly. "You wrote these?" Ethan nodded. "Most of them." She stared at him. The hidden competence she had sensed for months finally stood in front of her in plain view. Yet the greatest revelation had not arrived. Minutes later, the investor review began. The room filled with executives, board members, advisors, and stakeholders. Questions came quickly. Criticism came faster. Several executives once again questioned decisions tied to Claire's leadership and openly dismissed recommendations that had originated from Ethan. One board member even suggested that relying on a maintenance worker demonstrated poor judgment. Ethan listened quietly. Then Claire stood. Instead of defending herself, she placed the old reports on the conference table. She explained who had written them and how many of the current problems had been accurately identified years earlier. Skeptical faces remained unconvinced, until Ethan calmly opened the final document. Inside was a proposal he had developed years before leaving his career. Not only did it identify the company's vulnerabilities, it outlined practical solutions that could still be implemented today. As discussions continued, executives gradually realized something extraordinary. The fixes Ethan had quietly suggested throughout recent months were not guesses. They were pieces of a long-established strategy built by someone who understood the company better than many people currently leading it. The room grew quieter, then quieter still. One investor asked why the recommendations had never been implemented. Ethan answered honestly. He had submitted them before resigning to care for his wife during her illness. Leadership changed. Priorities shifted. The reports were forgotten. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The room went silent. Not because of his credentials, not because of his intelligence, because everyone finally understood what had happened. The man they had overlooked, doubted, and underestimated had spent years quietly protecting others while asking for nothing in return. The silence carried respect. Later that afternoon, additional evidence supported Ethan's recommendations. Investors approved a recovery plan. Confidence slowly returned. Claire's position stabilized. More importantly, trust began returning to the company. Yet the moment Ethan cared about most happened hours later. As he walked toward his pickup truck, his phone rang. The scholarship committee had reached a decision. Luke's application had been approved. The delays, reviews, and hearings were finally over. Ethan closed his eyes and smiled. That evening, father and son sat together on the porch as the sun disappeared beyond the neighborhood rooftops. Neither spoke much. They did not need to. Across town, Claire visited quietly and handed Ethan a small envelope. Inside was an offer for a senior advisory role designed around his family commitments. No pressure, no expectations, simply an opportunity, a second chance. Ethan thanked her and promised to consider it. Before leaving, Claire paused. "You saved more than the company," she said softly. You reminded people what integrity looks like. Months later, life looked different but remained grounded in the same values. Luke prepared for college. Ethan continued helping others, whether at the church parking lot, the hospital waiting room, or wherever someone needed support. Recognition had finally arrived, but it never changed him. The strongest part of his story was never his expertise. It was the choice he made again and again when nobody was watching. Responsibility over status. Character over recognition. Family over ambition. And in the end, the respect he earned came not from what he knew, but from who he chose to be. Quiet dignity had carried him through every setback. Integrity had opened every door. And the second chance that changed everything was not the one he received. It was the one he kept giving to others.